You don't know how free I am. You don't know how free I am. I am what I am, and I am free. You don't know how free I am.
Yo, check this. I might not be what you want me to be, so you might not see what you want to see. But if you got a minute, listen to what I gotta say, cause it's a brand new year and it's a brand new day. See, there's a gap between my culture and the life that I lead, so some will call me an apple, and some a bad seed. They have no idea how my heart will bleed. Their words and attitudes are things I just don't need.
You don't know how free I am. I am what I am, and I am free.
You see, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of where I'm from. Those ones spreading racism, they're just fucking dumb. Now if you're looking at my life, and you say I've assimilated, to simplify things, just a little more complicated. See, I'm a modern day native, with a modern day life. I have modern day problems, and modern day strife. Now I hear other natives, they talk about the past, and will I do the same? Fuck that. See, I've got no time to dwell on what's already done. I've got too many things that I want to do. And they don't include knives, and they don't include guns. I'm talking about knowledge and sharing it too. See, my people need to learn how to cohabitate, get rid of the anger, and get rid of the hate. We gotta stop for a minute and learn to educate. And you'll see in the end, we all have to communicate. I know there'll be a time to make a stand and a time to fight, but if you do that, make sure the cause is right. Because if the cause is right and the cause is just, greater numbers of people will be backing you up. History has repeatedly shown to us all that united we stand and divided we fall. They were talking about natives and natives alone, because this is a big world and this world is our home. Now I've seen some beautiful people and ugly ones too, and there's no single color that comes into view. So the message I'm sending, it's not all that long. It's just, I want the human race to be stronger than strong. I said I just want the human race to be stronger than strong.
You all have to be strong.
Done it. Word.
We all have to be strong. Peace.
This is a message for the youth.
Yeah, that's right. You know what I'm saying? This is a message out to you. Because we hearing what y'all listen to. And if y'all do what you do, because you do what you hear. And this is for you. So perk up your ear.
That's right, perk them up. Because this is straight out to you, the youth.
Yeah, to the youth. This is straight up knowledge. The kind of shit you won't get in no college.
To the youth.
To the youth.
Now, you can check out this native MC, trusted and true. This is native hip hop with a new attitude. Y'all might have noticed I'm a little bit older, but my attitude is a whole lot bolder. I keep my eyes over my shoulder for the younger MCs around that corner. Now y'all think you're gonna replace me? Ha! Come on up here and face me. And if you think that I am crazy, you haven't seen the half of me. So go ahead and try to stress me. But if you just talk about the way my woman dresses me, then you haven't got a clue on how to mess with me. That's why your shaky ass rhymes ain't impressing me.
Yeah. That's right. So I hope y'all youth are still listening. My homeboy, he's still whistling.
No, I'm tired of young MCs talking about chicken shacks. When in your rhymes, it's truth that you lack. I don't need to talk about the women who rub my skin, trying to get inside my pig pen. But if those be the girls that you like, you're gonna end up getting your blood spiked. So you better stop before you show your love. You better double up on your Pinot glove. Know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Because when it's raining outside, you take an umbrella. So before you pump her, you better wrap your thumper.
That's right. Straight up common sense. That's what I'm talking about. But for those of you who want to talk about violence, I know you just want to break up the silence. I can talk about my AK-47. I can put a bullet in your head and send you to heaven. But if that's the way I start to yell, then my body's going straight to hell. Besides, I don't want to be like Michael Harris, pretending I'm oh so fearless. As long as the trigger's in someone else's hand, is he really what you want to call a man?
I don't think so.
Not a chance.
A man. Michael Harris? No, that's a capital J-O-K-E joke.
Now you want to talk about smoking an 8-ball. I'm going to tell you about a man who had a great fall. He spent all night snorting up some snotty. Then he looked to the sky and said, "Beam me up, Scotty." He got so high up inside his head, couldn't even make it to his bed. So when his heart failed and he had died, who do you think sat down and cried? Hot damn, not a goddamn soul. Druggies took his dope and dropped him in a hole.
Now that is stone cold.
That's right, concrete cold. When you think it's impressive to swing back a 2-4 or a 60-pounder. After that, brother, you're just gonna fuck like a grounder. I know, cause I've been down with drugs, I've been down with booze. And if you go that way, you do nothing but lose. I ain't trying to be no preacher, but I am learning how to be a teacher. So I'll teach you things to make you wise. I'll tell you things to open your eyes. I don't need to tell you any lies, cause there's enough of that shit under our skies. See, my message comes from a different recipe. It starts with the teachings the elders taught to me. They said, look at all the people from sea to sea. But beware, brother, cause some will disagree. That peace has got to involve all the nations. That life is where we start communications. They don't understand every radio has many stations. Just like our planet has many creations.
Yeah, that's right. We're saying this is a message up to you. Cause we hear what y'all listen to. And if y'all do what you do, cause you do what you hear. And this is for you. So perk up your ears.
That's right, perk them up. Cause this is straight up to you, the you.
Yeah, to the you. This is straight up knowledge. The kind of shit you won't get in no college.
To the you.
Oh, the you.
Cause I'm telling you like it is. But now you want to try and change my flow.
You want to try and change the flow.
You want to try and change my flow.
You want to try and change the flow.
You want to try and change my flow.
Well, here's something that you better know.
Everything that I write,
It's got to do with every man's fight.
it's got to do with every man's plight.
It's got to do with breaking that stereotype.
And if peace is not your hype, I'll have to lyrically crush your type.
Break you down. Break you down.
This is a message for the youth, because we hear what you listen to.
Done it.
Word.
Siguli swagwag. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Gala hindi niyo gets. Wagi sli wagi. Niwa katoloda. Onida gangwa wenege. Ani bozo tanse. Okinapi. How? Yanko yugodonlas. For those of you who are here for the first time, I just introduced myself. I always do in my original language. And welcome in, Scorpion. Nice to see you. Um, so what I said is Sigoli Swagwag, or hello everyone, Galo Hindi Neo gets. So Galo Hindi is my name, and it translates to clouds passing over in the colonial language. And I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations of the Thames here on the northern part of Turtle Island, the part that's been segregated, relabeled Canada. And within this area, I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Huron nations, in an area that we call the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Treaty Territory, which in the colonial context means I'm in southwestern Ontario. And welcome in, Neil. And so today it's going to be a bit of a short stream. It's only maybe an hour, but it's our day 3 of our Lunch and Learn Intergenerational Impacts of Ongoing Systemic Racism is what we're focused on today. So there's going to be 2 speakers who are going to be part of this talk. As I put in their descriptions in the chat, if you're able to see them. So uh, Dr. Cynthia Wesley Esquimaux, or Eskimo, was appointed as the first Indigenous Chair of Truth and Reconciliation for Lakehead University in 2016. She was inducted into the honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2014 and is the chair of the governing circle of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. So she's a member and resident of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nations and has dedicated her life to building bridges to understanding. She sees endless merit in bringing people from diverse cultures, ages, and backgrounds together to engage in a practical dialogue and applied research initiatives. Our second speaker is Sandra Bender. Um, she's a lifelong human rights advocate and brings her passion to public education for her work. And as a second generation Canadian of grandparents who came to this land as immigrants and refugees, she has launched Indigenous Ally and strives to use her position of privilege to further understanding and reconciliation through outreach and education. Sandra is a proud member of the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus community, feminist and neurodivergent, and believes in bringing an intersectional lens to every aspect of her life. So past work has included Indigenous land claims advocacy, work with the unhoused communities in Winnipeg and Atlanta, and work with newly arrived refugees and projects with the local 2S LGBTQIA plus community. So, quite the speakers there. And it looks like it should be a good conversation, and hopefully we'll hear some content here. Now, I'm just looking through their list. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Today's day 3, as I said. Tomorrow would be day 4. Tomorrow, Lunch and Learns will be about the UNDRIP. Discussion on that UNDRIP, for those who don't know, is the United Nations Declaration of Rights and Rights and oh my goodness, the rights of Indigenous peoples. So UNDRIP. So that's going to be tomorrow. So tomorrow is actually going to be quite a longer day. So starting at 12 o'clock, George Brown College is going to host an Indigenous Knowledge Keeper series with Senator Mary Jane McCallum, a Cree woman appointed to the Senate by Justin Trudeau. Mary Jane is the first Indigenous person and first woman to be named Chancellor of Brandon University as of 2021, and often talks about the importance of awareness in relation to residential schools to a diverse number of uh, community populations, because we can't move forward on keeping this or maintaining this reputation of a human rights um, friendly country without that knowledge. So that's going to be at 12 o'clock tomorrow. 1:30 tomorrow will be our day 4 of the Lunch and Learn. 4 o'clock tomorrow will be a film screening called The Satang and discussion. It's hosted by Western University. Um, it's a documentary film that's a collaboration underwritten by Indigenous Initiatives, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and the School for Advanced Studies that brings together current and former students, faculty members at Western, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to make a film that showcases Indigenous youth and their perspectives on education. So it's going to feature members of the Chippewas of Nawash unceded nation, as well as indigenous nations in the London area, which would be the Onyadaag, which is my nation, the Chippewas of the Thames, and the Muncie Delaware.
Is intergenerational trauma and
Oh,
ongoing
this is
systemic
starting.
discrimination. We're so glad that you're all able to be with us today from all over Canada. This session is being simultaneously streamed in French and ASL and will also be available on the NCTR YouTube channel within the next few days for any of your friends who missed it. We are sold out today, so we are quite a crowd. Just before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to share that there are mental health resources available for anyone who needs. First, the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line provides 24-hour crisis support to former Indian residential school students and their families toll-free at 1-866-925-4419. It's also easy to find on Google if you missed that. There is also the Hope for Wellness Helpline, which is available 24/7 to all Indigenous people across Canada and can be accessed via telephone at 1-855-242-3310 or by online chat if you prefer that. That's on their website at hopeforwellness.ca. One last point of housekeeping before we get into this really important subject. You will see a Q&A button on your screens and you're welcome to use it. That said, there are literally thousands of us here, and I'll just say right now that it is very unlikely that we'll have time to answer a question from everyone, or possibly any at all. So we'll see how that goes. That said, we will be sharing some additional resources at the end. Now, it is my enormous privilege today to introduce our two guests, Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo and Krista Big Canoe, to hear a little in the time that we have about intergenerational impacts and ongoing systemic discrimination and what they believe is important for every Canadian to know in order to advance change. Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo was appointed as the first Indigenous Chair for Truth and Reconciliation for Lakehead University in 2016. She was inducted as an honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2014 and is chair of the governing circle for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation here at the University of Manitoba. She is a member and resident of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation and has dedicated her life to building bridges of understanding. She sees endless merit in bringing people from diverse cultures, ages, and backgrounds together to engage in practical dialogue and applied research initiatives. Krista Big Canoe is a First Nation woman, mother, and lawyer. She also comes from Georgina Island First Nation, an Anishinaabeg community. Krista has been a deputy clerk of the court and an administrative justice of the peace in and for the Northwest Territories. Her first legal practice experience was with the First Nation law firm Nawegabo et Corbière in Rama, Ontario. Krista was policy counsel for Legal Aid Ontario and the lead on the organization's province-wide Aboriginal justice strategy prior to becoming legal director for Aboriginal Legal Services. Krista returned to her position at ALS after a 2.5-year leave of absence so that she could be senior and then lead counsel for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. There's so much more that could be said about the two of you. That is your very condensed biographies. And I can't wait to have everyone hear and learn from the two of you. So just before I turn it over to you two, we're generally operating under the assumption that all of you present are not necessarily experts in the subject of intergenerational trauma. So to start us off, I'm just going to share a quick primer on the biological aspects of how trauma and intergenerational trauma work. So quickly, I know we all know of the general notion of trauma, but for an official definition, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health here in Canada defines trauma as the lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety, sense of self, and ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. Long after the traumatic event occurs, people with trauma can often feel shame, helplessness, powerlessness, and intense fear. Now, intergenerational trauma is defined by the American Psychological Association as a phenomenon in which the descendants of a person who has experienced a terrifying event show adverse emotional and behavioral reactions to the event that are similar to those of the person himself or herself. So we know that mental health and physical health are not two separate things, and the same holds true for trauma. There's a whole field of biological study called epigenetics, which studies molecular modifications to a person's phenotype, or in plain language, if you're not a biologist like me, their physical traits. So things which don't alter the DNA sequence, but are nonetheless changes that can be inherited by a person's children. One of the most broadly studied types of epigenetic modification is called DNA methylation. This is where environmental changes in a person's life can spur the attachment of a molecule called a methyl group to susceptible sites on a person's genes. The presence or absence of this type of methylation can change the way the DNA is used, including how and how much the genes are expressed. Abnormal methylation has been linked with things like eye disease, cancer, and psychiatric disorders. Furthermore, one particular type of abnormal methylation is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which tends to occur in situations where an expecting mother is experiencing fear. BDNF methylation in newborn male children specifically has been linked to increased risk of major depression, bipolar disorder, behaviors of self-harm, and an increased risk of suicide. In short, trauma is something which literally leaves a physical mark on a person, which can then be inherited by their children. So let's talk about how we see this playing out in the factors that work across this land today. Cynthia, your PhD is in this area. Would you like to speak to this first?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for that. But I also want to really stress, I think, very, very carefully that it can be affected in the positive as well. Like one of the things that I think our communities have started to understand is that that DNA effect, that all the things that you're talking about can go in a negative direction. But if we stimulate in a positive direction, we can actually start to correct those imbalances and those trauma responses, and that, like what we call a legacy effect. So I don't want anybody to lose hope when they hear that kind of thing, because they go, oh my goodness, well, there's nothing I can do. Because we also know that epigenetic effect can last as many as 14 generations. But we can cut that shorter by doing different kinds of decisions and raising our kids differently, and also keeping our kids in our houses. So that's a long part of the conversation on trauma is the a number of kids we have in foster care and adoptive care, all part of this conversation. So I just want to make sure that that's very clear.
Yeah, that absolutely is. I've just gotten a small message from our two interpreters that we should talk slower. I know it's hard when we have limited time, and it's very important.
Okay.
How would either of you describe the way you see the effects of this intergenerational trauma playing out? And we'll talk about how that turns around too, how we do break that cycle of violence and trauma being expressed. But how would you say that we can still look around at our society today and say, oh, that's an effect of trauma directly?
Go ahead.
Maybe,
Kristen.
thanks. Yeah, maybe I'll start with that one. So essentially, like the lived experience of any Indigenous person in this country arguably demonstrates signs of intergenerational trauma. Now, as Cynthia has explained, there's ways to break that cycle or to sort of renew and focus on positive, but like, let's just look at a couple, unarguable realities in this country. So all we have to do is look statistically, or look with numbers at things like the poverty levels of Indigenous people in this country, regardless of whether they're First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, whether they're in community or in urban settings, then we can look at other numbers. Like we can look at how many people Canada mass incarcerates that are Indigenous. We have some of the worst statistics globally of Indigenous people in custody. In fact, it's so comparable to the mass incarceration of Black people in the United States that I no longer call Indigenous people in Canadian custody overrepresentation. I simply refuse to do that anymore. It's mass incarceration. We can look at, a number of factors that are often seen as sort of part of a wellness index or indicators of wellness, and unfortunately, Indigenous populations fall lower. These are all sort of cumulative things that we can actually, like see visibly see. Having said that, the other flip side of that is the strengths or how we break those cycles. So I tend to put myself forward as a good example. Like I am a Indigenous woman who has a law degree, who walks in a place of privilege and education, and I am an Indigenous person. So we need to start sort of recentering the conversation on how we overcome the struggle or those things. But in all fairness, in the work I do at Aboriginal Legal Service, or any of my staff does at Aboriginal Legal Service, every day we assist individuals and Indigenous individuals. You can see the impacts of intergenerational trauma and harm play
Yeah.
out. And so we don't escape it. And I think Cynthia can probably touch on this better. Like we're talking, in terms of epigenetics, like 14 generations of that trauma transfer.
Yeah, it can't, I mean, and Krista is absolutely correct. I got a message from Thunder Bay yesterday asking for some partnership with Lakehead University on sustainable food sustainability and food sovereignty. And they said 80% of their inmate population in Thunder Bay is Indigenous. So that is like today. That's not, gee, is this something that we have to look at somewhere else? It's right here, right now. But I think that we've done an incredible job of actually correcting a lot of what has happened. So in my generation, my parents came directly out of residential school, and everything that they carried with them out of those schools, they didn't understand or know about. They never talked about the psychological impacts of that. They never thought about how my parenting is a good or bad or indifferent. They just did what they had to do with what they had. And I think that's the forgiveness factor that a lot of our people have come to understand, that things happened. It wasn't necessarily good things, but if we can forgive and move forward, maybe we won't forget, but we can move forward. It means that our kids and our grandchildren have a better chance of living in this world and accommodating that two-eyed seeing that the Mi'kmaq speak about. But they can get that education in a Western institution, although we are indigenizing like crazy. And they can get, on the land learning. And I think a lot of universities are actually incorporating now, including law schools, incorporating land-based learning, which has a tremendous impact on people's well-being.
Do you want to tell us more about how and why?
Why? Because getting outside into the great, great outdoors is the thing that's going to help anybody. I mean, even the Japanese understood forest bathing. The fact of the matter is, we live in these cities, in these constructed artificial spaces that are very detrimental to our health. We get outside. I mean, I'm coming to you from my reserve. You get outside, and the wind is blowing, and the water, and the lake is right there. The trees are waving, the birds are singing. How can that not impact your good health and your well-being? So I think we have to do a lot more of that and understand that this tightly narrated definition of education that we've all been subjected to under, with European values is not necessarily the direction anybody needs to go into the future, and that we have to start to embrace Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous, alternative dispute resolution processes. There's so much that we can do better, and we've always had that. Now people are finally starting to listen.
And if I could just jump in and add, so we're talking about it in a very kind of clinical definition of what is intergenerational trauma, and we're talking about epigenetics. And I always kind of go back to this concept of blood memory. So this is something Indigenous people for time immemorial have believed in, and quite frankly, through courses of science and stuff, those crazy Indigenous people think of something called blood memory. But blood memory is actually demonstrated and proven, like the same theories that you see in epigenetics. And so when we look at that and we tap into it, so Cynthia was talking earlier about, you can focus on the positive aspects, but I actually believe in my core as an educated woman that our blood memory actually also has inherent strengths. Like when I go out into, and when I'm in my community, I go out into the bush, I just have a sense of belonging and feeling that I'm grounded to that space, but that I understand my surroundings in a way that you're never going to teach me in a book. Right. So that connection that we have. So not only do we have intergenerational trauma, which has been created by colonial legacies and harms, we also have intergenerational strength. And once we start to tap into the intergenerational strength, we can build our own knowledge. And I'm always a huge proponent of saying knowledge is power. And I'm always like throwing all sorts of resources at people. But part of that knowledge is the regrounding, even just with Mother Earth, right? That regrounding with you have connection to land, you have connection to community, you have connection to your family. That broadens your concept of relationship. And we've been so harmed that sometimes that full breakdown of the relationships within our communities or within our own families sometimes feels really hard to overcome. But when we return to cultural practices, when we take up our ceremonies or some of our practices, whether that's like rice gathering or certain ceremonies or just spending time together, we're actually repairing some of that harm that was caused externally by like turning back into ourselves, into our culture. Right. And that's the way I like to simply approach it. And
Yeah.
that's the way I tend to talk about it.
Yeah, we can also do a great deal and offer a great deal to the world through the practice of movement towards harmony. We have, long before contact, there were already alliances set up between nations. We understood the practice of reciprocity, of sharing, of working together in spaces where it was essential. Maybe we divided ourselves accordingly when it was okay, but in times that were hard, we understood the need to actually share resources. And that's something that I think we tried, very hard to teach this country as it was forming, and that it really didn't want to listen to, because we live in a society that has a lot of incivility in it, and it really doesn't work. And the other piece is wealth. The whole concept of wealth and the need to, or I guess I would say, never getting to enough in this society. Indigenous peoples understand wealth in a very different way. Having your language, having your family, having the love of friends, and having a safe and comfortable home, that's wealth. Not how many billions do you need to have before you can fall asleep at night, which seems to be essential to some people. But the realities are, if you look at it's complex, but at the simplicity of Indigenous understandings that are also, underneath that, very complex, you understand that you don't need a whole lot of damage done to the world to be able to accommodate a good life, to live well. It's really important that we think differently, I think, and we're trying our best to accommodate that with academic institutions, certainly in the law, the work that Krista does. She brings into it a whole other kind of a worldview.
Absolutely. We've had a question come in, and you might know the answer to this, but someone has asked, does demethylation occur with land connection? Do we know anything about that? Is there work being done on this?
I don't know if work's actually being done on it, but if it's not, it should be. But I will say this, I know that Western science and Indigenous traditional knowledge, what I guess you would call them scientists as well, are now working together. They're forming relationships, partnerships. And a lot of it started, I think, at the University of Arizona, but they're working together to actually show how symbiotic our belief systems and our knowledge bases actually are. So that would not surprise me that can be demonstrated very clearly and unequivocally.
I can't think of like specific empirical reports, but I can think of a couple of things. So the Wellness House, which is located in Toronto at St. Michael's Hospital, Dr. Janet Smiley has done some work, and she's currently doing work that is narrative based, but it's like the reconnection to culture. And they're using research and sort of like measurements, so like assessments, pre-assessments, post-assessments, going into the therapy to see what the impact and effect is. So I think it's definitely a developing area. Anecdotally, what I can tell you is, having done this work for 20 years, when people are reconnected to the community, what we see is lower rates of recidivism when they've had like criminal background. We see opportunities for healing when there's reconnection to the community. And most of our programs, and we call it Indigenous dispute resolution. We don't refer to as alternative. Alternative is to the Canadian justice system. Indigenous is dispute resolution by our community for our community. And when you have Indigenous dispute resolution, the outcomes are usually pretty strong. And will people fall back into habits? Will people sometimes do things like, in mainstream language, they call that reoffend or recidivism? Yes. But if we look at it from a place of healing and work that needs to be ongoing and continuous to have that that the good life that Cindy's talking about, it's a recurring pattern. It's not like a snap. You've had one cultural session, so now you're cured. It's about a life practice, right? It's about having that opportunity, the diversity, and the options to participate continuously within one's own culture, like that lifelong learning journey
Mhm.
is what promotes and perpetuates the success.
Krista, I would also call that restorative practice, because it's not only about, sort of resolving a conflict. It is actually about restoring the goodwill and the caring between people, creating that gift exchange possibility where people can say, not necessarily sorry or I forgive you, but just, yes, we can work in harmony together. And I think restorative practice happens not only in law, but in other areas, including, of course, reconciliation. And we've had a lot of conversations around reconciliation, and people seem to be wanting to move the conversations reconciliation. But I would say, and I'm sure Krista would agree, that we haven't yet fully addressed the truth. There is still a lot of outstanding work. Krista worked on the missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry. I had the privilege of actually working on the pre-inquiry process and listening to people talk across the country, really thousands of people. And I remember very clearly and unequivocally that almost in every session that I did, that people would say, why can't Canadian people see us as human beings? And that's a really hard thing to hear when you understand that a lot of the women and fathers and brothers and sisters and aunties that are standing in that room do not feel that the Canadian population around them actually sees them as human beings, and so therefore doesn't care what happens to them. And of course, the whole question around the digging into the waste sites in Winnipeg is a very good example of that. And people are very, strongly articulating the need to treat people with dignity and respect. And of course, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, that has not stopped. That is still going on full force, and children being removed from our homes and our communities, especially northern communities. So we're still in this place. And I had this conversation the other day about the atrocities. It's just not bad things happen in residential institutions. Atrocities happened. And if you can imagine, I can't put in your head what is in mine, and I'm sure Krista's, about the kinds of things that people experience as children. What the lust of people will do to a child is actually shocking. And that's something that's real. And people are still not necessarily over that. And many people across Canada do not fully understand the depth of the damages that were done and why it continues to resonate into the present.
But actually connects well to another question that was put forward, which was wondering if intergenerational trauma is only passed biologically.
No, I think it's passed through a variety of different kinds of mechanisms. I mean, there are stories, there are behaviors, there are certainly biological implications, parenting implications, the media implications, what we're told to believe and understand. You listen to media that places Inuit children in a state where they figure there's no point in trying to go to school. I'm going to die early anyway, because that's all I hear from media. So how, we're affecting Indigenous peoples every day, even though we may not even realize it, by virtue of that, or pulling up only those stories that are hurtful and not lifting the stories that are very powerfully about strength-based activities and learning.
Well, and that dehumanization of Indigenous peoples is literally foundational to the history of the Canadian state, right? The very notion that you could conquer empty land, not seeing the all of the nations that existed well before the Canadian state was formed, as actually people with nations and civilizations and cultures of equal value, at least. So yeah, literally that concept has been around since before Canada was a country.
Right. Yeah. And like just sort of hopping on here, when we look at things like the impacts that we experience, we need to recognize there is continuing trauma that occurs, not just because of the historical legacy, but exactly what Cynthia was talking about in relation to the perpetuation of stereotypes, racism, discrimination. We can't talk about one sector of our society or institutions that still doesn't carry a level of systemic discrimination. Healthcare is a perfect example. Unfortunately, we've had some very like acute examples of that. I think of Miss Eshquan, or I think of Brian Sinclair, and we see that, but it happens at like a micro level in almost every region. And so, when we talk about things like education or being heard or truth, so Cynthia talked about, well, we can't get to reconciliation until we hear truth. So, for example, as we went across the country with the national inquiry and we had 16 community hearings. And that's where we heard from families and survivors of violence or people who had women disappeared or murdered. And, a lot of people were very critical, like, oh, having them tell their story, it's just re traumatizing. And I agree that can be true. Having people hear your story, listen to it, and actually believe it can also be very healing. It's a type of acknowledgement that something's happened. It's this acknowledgement of truth as it exists to a person. So when those stories are understood and contextualized, and when those stories are taken up and we have like the age appropriate conversations with even our little people up through to our elders. And our elders are actually a really kind of, it's a difficult struggle sometimes talking even with in our own communities, because they have their own discrimination and types of racism based on the time periods they came from. But when we have these conversations and we talk about the truth and what indigenous people have experienced, we have to recognize, so to allies or to settlers, they need to recognize that their continued presence or some of the things they're doing, or like the way the media will portray indigenous women, is still continuing a type of trauma that's impacting our people. Like when indigenous people heard about Kamloops and the 215 unmarked graves. I think of myself as a pretty tough lawyer. That week I could like cry at the drop of a pin, right? And I am a emotionally stable individual who's had a lot of counseling and done good work my whole life to deal with my own harm that's occurred in my life. And I was very angry though, and I was doing some media around that because everyone wanted to know, what do we think? What's the legal position? What's this? And I think, the first thing I remember saying, and it probably almost sounded hostile, was like, we didn't need 215 little bodies to know the harm that's been done to our people. We literally, for decades now, our artists in particular, through poetry, through song, through art, have been expressing the harm that's occurred. Those expressions of harm, which are very difficult for some people to look at, are actually healing and part of that truth telling that Indigenous people often have to do. So, like, I think, and I agree with Cynthia, we're not at a concept or place of it's not Indigenous people that need to reconcile with the issues that have happened. It's we need to have the acknowledgement of the truth, and that there is a continued legacy that's still creating. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, it's important to see the epigenetics or the background, but it's also important to recognize trauma is occurring even now. And so unless we are willing as society to start to address all of those types of trauma, then we're never going to get out of the loop of it. Even if individuals can heal, even if families and communities can heal, as a whole society, we're still going to see those horrific statistics, like Indigenous children being apprehended at the highest rate it ever has been in Canadian history.
What she says about children. My daughter is a director at the University of Ottawa and had a baby in August of 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. And a man walked through her room without a mask, and she asked the nurse to tell the guy to put on a mask. And my daughter looks a lot like I do, long hair. And the nurse looked at her and said to her, "If you complain, I'm calling CAS on you." So that happens just like that. It's not, again, a faraway thing. It happens directly to people that we know and to us. It just happens everywhere. So you can't, feel like, well, that was then and this is now and we should get over it. It's still happening. So it doesn't go away. The other thing I want to just raise into all of this too is this whole question again around reconciliation and what's happening is the whole question of how the wording, the language gets co-opted. So we talk about we use different kinds of words in different kinds of ways. What reconciliation means to me may not be the same to somebody that's sitting in an academic institution, for instance. And I often get told, well, we're trying to decolonize. And I say to people, you know what? It is not my job to decolonize. Canada needs to decolonize. The government needs to decolonize. Academic institutions need to decolonize. But I can tell you right now from day one, I'm going to be indigenizing the hell out of everything. I'm bringing in everything that I understand and believe, and I'm going to place it and ensure that those contested spaces accommodate the Indigenous students and the Indigenous employees and Indigenous women and children that are coming into those spaces because they've been contested long enough. So it's really hard to do the kind of work that Krista and I do, and I've been doing it for a lot longer. I'm a lot older than Krista, but I still have the passion. I still have the wherewithal to do this work, even though I carry it in my head, as Krista, I know she does, the stories that are absolutely devastating. And I don't want to put that in people's heads because I don't want them to have to carry what I have to carry. But I can tell you that, those tears come pretty easily in the work that we do for us as well.
That is not at all difficult to believe. We've had a number of questions about the child welfare system. I think that's enough to be a whole separate session. But I just want to highlight the notion that, the fact that Indigenous families are simply investigated more than non-Indigenous families are. We know for a fact that child neglect happens in families of every single type of ethnic background. It's just that non-Indigenous families are less likely to be checked out for it. A white person with a fresh newborn complaining to a nurse for someone not wearing a mask in the middle of a global pandemic would never have received that threat. That is simply a fact. So yeah, it's those structures that are still in place. We won't have time to get to all of the other questions around this.
I just want to add to that, that people don't know that there were birth alerts in most hospitals across the country. That when a woman, or even a man, a husband, had been in care at some point in their lives, they were targeted or tagged. So when they had a child, a birth alert was often issued because of their background, not because they are going to be a terrible parent, or not because they're some kind of an addict, but because they're deemed not capable of parenting. And I remember a girl saying to me, they took my baby away. I was in care most of my life. And you took me into care because you didn't think my parents could care for me. Should I not be a better parent now because you raised me? And so that dichotomy is a really important consideration that we have to start to think about, because even for the Black community, who raised white families' children for generations? Black women. And yet 40% of the kids in care in the greater GTA are Black. It's just ridiculous. It really is. So people need to know those kinds of things so that they have a better sense of why the resonance is happening, or why we're still having this conversation, or why we're not at reconciliation. And we may not be at reconciliation in our lifetime, because the truth has been buried so deeply for so long that it's going to take time.
And just in terms of looking at it from a legal perspective, when we look at the child welfare system as a whole, it was a system, and the bringing Indigenous children into care actually was like the industrial complex. It made money for that system. So back in 1951, the Indian Act had a change in the law that put the jurisdiction of Indian children over to the provinces. And if you go across the provinces now, even in 2023, they all have various metrics. They have a chart on neglect, okay? And it has you can sort of almost do a number or a check off. Is there food at home? Is there this or there's that? And you're saying, that Indigenous people are looked at more often, even if they weren't looked at more often, knowing the reality of poverty that exists within the Indigenous community in this country because of all of the unfair practices or the unfair laws, you have more Indigenous people people experiencing poverty. The metrics also don't take into account Indigenous values. So if you walk into my home and I have empty cupboards, but for instance, my freezer's full of moose meat, right? Or we collect or we fish because we're eating fresh food from the land. And that doesn't meet your metrics of what, because I don't have a whole bunch of, cans full of, additives in my cupboard to feed my children. Right. So part of the problem is not understanding the two different value systems or worldviews that might exist and using a metrics that only looks at sort of the mainstream society. But we always got to contextualize this, and it's a money making business to apprehend children. It is even for Indigenous organizations that can do it. It's only been more recently when we've had, advocacy like Dr. Blackstock with the First Nation Caring Society, as we raise more awareness around these issues. And any of these, like you said, could be a whole day's topic, not even just a lunch and learn.
Yeah,
It really
absolutely.
is. It really is. And Cindy Blackstock's work should be looked at when you think about what's happening with child welfare. I mean, she's done an incredible job of getting the federal government to acknowledge the fact that it has been discriminating against Indigenous children. But there are issues around, I mean, it's the province that actually manages child welfare dollars. So they often intercept monies that should go directly to First Nation communities, really, to do the work in their communities to ensure families have the supports they need. They intercept that money and they hire their own social workers, or they do other kinds of things. The dollars need to be put directly where they're needed, and that's in prevention. And the relationship with the provinces needs to be addressed. Standards need to be addressed. You can't have a 5-bedroom house in a remote community. The houses are small for good reason. It's 40 below zero, and many of them are still on wood stoves. So there's lots of things that need to be thought about here. It's not a simple answer, and even when it seems like a simple answer, we will all have to acknowledge that it's very complex underneath. So child welfare is a big conversation, and it's worth having. It probably can't be had here today, but I think it's a really important conversation. It's one of my closest to heart conversations that I have on a regular basis.
When it is one of those direct ongoing impacts of the residential school system, right? Where then we remove children from their homes and families to take them to boarding schools. And now we're still removing them from their families and communities to put them into other families and communities. It's the same system, just transformed a little bit in how it's being practiced, right?
Well,
So,
and sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
One of the things we heard in the national inquiry, coast to coast to coast, all over the country, was the families. So families who would lose their children for whatever reasons, whether it be neglect, most of the time it wasn't abuse, then they would be put into a non-Indigenous household. And so the Indigenous family wouldn't be paid the resource, or couldn't say on something like Ontario Works or what's considered welfare or disability type of benefits, could not get as much money. But if they remove the child from the home and they put them in a non-Indigenous home, that family would get 3 times the amount of the entire household. Why are we not redistributing the wealth so that the Indigenous families can maintain their children in the same way, so that, those circumstances of neglect or lack of food aren't even an issue? So we won't pay you, Indigenous mother that doesn't know well enough, the same amount we'll pay this white family to watch your children. And then we heard that all across the country. And so, that was one of the issues. Like, how is it that each of these systems reward families that don't actually have the kids? And like, I'm not knocking, there's foster parents that do good work and take children, and there are circumstances where we absolutely need foster parents to take care of our children if they're in situations of harm or abuse. But how is it the system pays non-Indigenous families 3 times the amount that they'll ever give an Indigenous family to raise the same child? It's nonsensical, right?
They also make families make choices. I spoke to a grandmother in Saskatchewan who said, I have 3 children of my daughter, 3 of my daughter's children. I get $200 per child. It's not enough to cover books, food, winter clothing, boots, and all those things. So she said, I went to the CAS and I said, is it possible for me to get more resources? Because I need to support these children, and I'm retired and I'm on a fixed income. And they said, well, you can surrender the children. And then if you surrender the children, you can apply for them. But then they told her, but there's a very good chance you won't get them, because when you were 16 and now she's now 66, when you were 60 or 18, you had some kind of thing happen in court. So you will probably not be able to get them. Well, what kind of a choice is that to make? So she said, well, you know what, we'll all sooner starve than, give them up to you. But that's wrong. She's, it just boggles the mind. And that's when you ask about reconciliation, you ask about continuing discrimination and ongoing trauma. Those are the things that create all of that. Because now this woman, and she, she's crying and she's talking to me about it. And I'm saying, I agree with you that it's wrong, that you have to make that kind of choice as a grandmother. So we have to start at the beginning. It becomes that up the river thing. We're pulling bodies out of the river down here, but we need to go to the top of the river and ask ourselves why bodies are going into the river in the first place. And that's where we really need to do our work as a country. And that's where the financial supports and assistance and realities have to be.
Absolutely. So then looking at breaking that cycle with all of these odds going against a person, and just talking about an individual, not even their family unit or the entire community or the entire country, but how does that start to happen that a person can actually break out of that cycle of trauma and trauma and trauma? I know, Krista, you definitely wanted to speak to that. So,
well, I think we both showed it. Go ahead, Krista. Yeah.
I think we both actually will always say, whenever we're speaking with any group, if we don't focus on the strength, we don't move forward, right? But essentially, like, sometimes the number one principle we have at Aboriginal Legal Service here is meeting an individual where they're at. And sometimes they're just not in the place to heal. So how do you provide community support around that individual? How do you provide them cultural opportunity? How do you provide them healing opportunities, right? They may not be at that place. So you got to meet individuals where they're at, because everyone's at sort of a different place in their lived experience, or the harm that they've experienced, or that the trauma they're continuing to experience as a result of colonial legacy. So that's the first thing, is like, as helpers, community helpers, we need to recognize where people are at and not assume that we can like snap our fingers and instantaneously, and so that's part of it, is recognizing individuals will have individual needs. The second part of it is increasing those cultural and Indigenous specific opportunities, right? When you do that, and when people can feel pride. So I'm lucky. I grew up my whole life being a proud big canoe woman, being told who I am. And look at me, I'm fairly white presenting. It's funny because in my family, there's only about 4 of us that look like this, and the rest look like Cynthia. And so essentially, though, I regardless of my appearance, I grew up being told who I was, where I came from, and everything I would be able to accomplish, right? That positive influence. And despite, potential harm, alcoholism, all sorts of things, you break out of cycles when you empower the next generation, when you give them the opportunities to learn and do, but also be part of everything that we are as people. And like, we are not frozen in time. We don't have to do a ceremony that was 3,000. We can do a ceremony that was 300 years old, but we don't have to do that to be able to find strong Indigenous identity. But when we have a sense of belonging, we also know this from life promotions, right? For youth, because we have a suicide epidemic also in this country of Indigenous children. We know from life promotion practices that when there's a sense of belonging to community, when there's a sense and use of culture, it increases success. So that's the first, like, for me, that's almost always the first goal, but it always starts with meeting the person where they're at, right? Give them the support, they will get there and take the steps the rest of the way.
Yes. And I believe that all absolutely works. It's interesting because Krista's experience was not my experience. Both my parents spent 20 years in residential schools between them. And there was a lot of violence, domestic violence in my household. There was a lot of alcoholism, and there was a lot of sexual violence. And there was a lot of things that were going very badly. And growing up in a community like Toronto, where a lot of people came to the city from residential schools, there was a lot of dysfunction. And I remember as a kid being very lost all of the time and not understanding what the hell was going on. Like, what is wrong with everybody? Why is everybody behaving like this? But I think one of the things that you can do, and when I say you, I mean the collective you that is listening in, is you can work as much as possible to mentor young people. Because one of the things that made it possible for me to ultimately be successful was that somebody gave a shit about what was happening to me. People said it's going to be okay. And I had teachers and I had friends and I had adults and I had other kids say to me, it's going to be okay. And I learned to tell myself it's going to be okay. And I just quickly want to share with you also a dream I had where my grandfather, Lorenzo Big Canoe, showed up in a dream when I was 15 years old and having a very difficult time as a bear, as a talking bear, but there he was, and said, it's going to be okay and you should keep going. So you have to pull from a lot of places, and all of you can mentor children and teenagers in a good way and ensure that they are interested in books and ensure that they're interested in learning, and take them out into the bush and take them out on the land and take them to theater and take them places where they've never been. Take them to the restaurants, you know, do all the kinds of things that open up their understandings of the world. And you're going to see people be successful. I dropped out of school at 16. I went to work, you know, and I moved to California. And what I learned when I was living in California, that it wasn't my little brown face that was the problem. It was the environment in which I was living. And so if you're living in an environment with a lot of racism and a lot of discrimination, and you're Indigenous, people don't like it that you are, then it's going to be very difficult for you to survive. If you move yourself out of that space and into another space where people look at you as a human being and accept you for who you are, and you can build a sense of identity as a human being, then you're going to be okay. And I went back to school when I was in California, came back to Toronto and enrolled at the University of Toronto, and moved all the way through to getting a doctorate in anthropology with the support of people around me who said, when I cried and said, I can't do this, said, yeah, you're going to be fine, get back to work. So we can come from very diverse backgrounds. We can be challenged in very different kinds of ways, but we have to have a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of I'm okay. That whole adage, you're okay, I'm okay. We need to know that. And we have to be able to ask a kid, are you okay? And we have to listen to what they have to say. And you're going to find that kid's going to be okay. And I open up my phone I give kids my number, so you just call me anytime. Text me whenever I don't care if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're having a crisis, text me, I will talk to you. And that saves a lot of kids, and we mentor a lot. I mentor a lot of kids because of that. And we can do that. That's not a grand commitment. Find kids and do it. Yeah.
Well, and just generationally, like even within one generation, when you have role models or people that do things. So like I'm Lorenzo Big Canoe's youngest granddaughter. And Cynthia made a joke. We wouldn't have brought up the age thing. Cynthia made a joke earlier that she's a lot older than me. So she's the eldest female granddaughter of Lorenzo Big Canoe. So even within one generation, when you have role models and people you can reach out to, it has an impact, right? And then you continue to be a role model for others. It's that giving back, right? It's that reciprocal. Like I had an opportunity, and Cynthia's right. Like I've heard tough times too. Like I've heard you can do it, but I've also heard it, the not tough love, but like you can do it. You need to do better. So one hand lifting up and cheerleading, the other hand being like, you want to do something for yourself and your community. And so there's a sense of responsibility and obligation, but I welcome that because it's a type of accountability back to my own people or to my own community. And so like me being the youngest female in that generation had role models. Like people are always like, oh, it's so amazing, you're a lawyer. I'm like, yeah, I have a PhD and a gynecologist and a master's student. Like we had all of these people to look up to. Right. So it's a self-perpetuating success if a family starts healing, even if it's not every family member, right? Even if it's only some family members, it's a self-perpetuating success if you have some other people to lean on.
That makes so much sense. We're coming to the end of our time. So unfortunately, there are so many questions that as I predicted and warned you all at the beginning, we haven't had time to get to, but there are also a ton of expressions of thanks and of a sense of having been heard, some echoings of the same kinds of lived experiences that you've both had. On the part of everyone here and from the NCTR as well, thank you both so much for, in this tiny amount of time, to cover such a big topic. Thank you for sharing from your experiences, from your wisdom, from your education. Thank you for all of that. It's just incredible. And before we go, I'm just going to leave us with, I'm going to share my screen now. So hopefully you'll still be able to see the ASL. There we go. So I'm going to leave us with some further questions to go away with and reflect on here. So how do you see the impacts of intergenerational trauma playing out in current societal systems today? So this is for you to take back to your own home communities from wherever you're joining us from today. Look at your cities and your towns and ask yourself, what am I seeing that is related to intergenerational trauma? Where can you identify conscious or unconscious bias in various areas of Canadian society, the justice system, the healthcare system, the child welfare system, which we certainly did touch on already? What steps can you personally take to start uncovering and addressing your own unconscious bias? And finally, because I really do want to leave us off on this note of Indigenous resilience, where do you see that happening in spite of ongoing systemic discrimination? It is there to see it, to see. We are seeing an enormous resurgence of Indigenous cultural reclamation and a beautiful turn in resilience. So ask yourself where you can find that, and then go and tell a friend. Next, here are a very short list of resources. I'm not aware of the full details, but everyone who registered for a Lunch and Learn this week will be getting a mass list of resources at the end of the week. But I do want to share at least just a few, not least, a book written by Cynthia. A Knock on the Door is your go-to resource for the history of the residential schools, written by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are a few other books here too. If you are a white person, I cannot stress enough the need to read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. There's a film, if that's more your style as well. We also have a brand new, oh, sorry, this is not in the mode it should be on. There we go. Here, we have a brand new interactive messaging app. So you can take out your phones now and scan the QR code. And that will actually answer some questions that you can put in. It's very nifty. It actually just got ready in time for this. Sorry, I moved off that screen too fast. So go ahead and take down that QR code. And then finally, we do have two more Lunch and Learns this week. Tomorrow's theme is Indigenous Peoples' Rights and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. On Friday, it's taking action towards reconciliation. So let me get out of my screen share here. Those events may appear to be sold out, but if they are, keep on trying. As sometimes people cancel and then tickets become available. So thank you for joining us, whether you've only been here today, whether this is your third of the week and you're coming back tomorrow. And again, thank you enormously to our two guests today, Krista and Cynthia. Thanks so much for your time. It's a real gift.
Miigwech for having me.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Mama P.
Have a good rest of your days, everyone. Thanks again for coming.
Siguli Swagwag, Galahindi Neogets. Again, as I said, this was going to be a bit of a short stream today, but I wanted to ensure we got that discussion in shared out there so that people could hear some of the ways that we can deal with intergenerational trauma caused by the residential school system, and so there's some interesting aspects on how to do that, and systemic issues do have to be dealt with on some sort of level, whether that's revamping the healthcare system, the political system, the media system, all aspects that are currently affecting the indigenous people in maintaining the systemic problems that are plaguing us still. So I hope that again you will join us tomorrow. As I mentioned, tomorrow we've got hosted by the George Brown College, the Indigenous Knowledge Keeper Series with Senator Mary Jane McCallum, a Cree woman who was appointed to the Senate by Justin Trudeau. Mary Jane, again, is the first Indigenous person and first woman to be named Chancellor at Brandon University as of 2021, and she often talks about the importance of awareness when it comes to the residential schools, because we can't maintain that movement forward without, first of all, ensuring that people are aware of its history. Tomorrow's Lunch and Learn is about the UNDRIP, so United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, which is going to be hosted by the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation. We have that's going to be at 1:30, and at 4 o'clock we have the film project Nasatang, which will be, as we discussed, is a documentary also hosted by Western University, and that's going to be a collaboration. It was underwritten by the Indigenous Initiatives, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and the School of Advanced Studies. It brings together current and former students and faculty members at Western, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to make a film that showcases the Indigenous youth and their perspectives on education. And so it's going to have members of the Chippewas of Nawash, unceded nation, as well as the members of the communities from around here, which will be the Onondaga, the Chippewas of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation will all be involved in that as well. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to be a guest on the Towards Night stream, and we'll discuss the origin of the stream, its purpose, its goals, and possibly do a spoken word performance. So lots of stuff happening there. So I'm going to set up a raid. So what I'm going to do first of all, as we always do at the end of each stream, is we want to play a rendition of the Peaceful Warrior, just to kind of as we set up and raid out. So anyone who has not heard, I'm sure most of you have by now. I'll give you a little blurb there as to what the Peaceful Warrior Project is. And I just look here and see. I'm gonna actually, here's one I haven't played in a long time. The Neo-Kalalams, if you don't know who they are a couple from Singapore. They're actually not only singers and songwriters, and they do a lot of covers, but they're also actors who have done numerous films. So they're got quite the following, and they honored me by doing a rendition of the Peaceful Warrior, which they blended in with their own song, because their social and political kind of aim or angle really coincides with ours. So I'm going to get my mug off the screen, and we'll get this started by the Neo-Kalalams, and I hope you'll stick around and copy a raid call and join me with the stream that we whoever we go into.
Runs with Wine, and everybody, we hope you enjoy this song. It's kind of like a mashup,
yes,
of our original songs with Dark Natives or Galahundes,
yes,
Galahundes poem, The Peaceful Warrior.
Yeah, which is in itself a beautiful concept. Yeah. 3, 4.
Neo-Kalalams, that's us. Welcome to the Neo-Kalalam Social Club. The Neo-Kalalam is where the ukulele. We're the ukulele's, we're at war for peace. All senseless attacks we see must cease. We fight for the ones who can't fight back. We battle for all the people who lack. We're the ukulele's from Singapore. We sing for justice without pawpaw. We make a stand with ukuleles in hand. If you believe, come join our band together. Ooh, yeah, together. Ooh, yeah. There's much more power in one man's voice than all the weapons of military choice. Add your voice to our voice, we can shout out loud. We belong to the human race and we are proud. Ooh. Hello everybody. We sendiri syok. Syok means of course feel good. Jiak babe, how are you? Have you eaten? We're the ukulele's here to sing and laugh and eat with you while fighting for freedom together. Hey, in Singapore, Pink Dot has just passed fighting for the freedom to love. Write to your MP and say, repeal 377A. It's an old outdated law. Let's move on, Singapore. We have seen how the world can be devastated to the actions of men with minds of hatred. Why discriminate? Choose love instead of hate. While we're at it, let's ask them to abolish the death penalty. You know what? We're executing the poor, the underprivileged, the uneducated. It's insanity. Everyone deserves a second chance at life. Let's not make state murder rife. But we can't move this world alone. So just remember, this is also your home. So if we put my voice with his voice and your voice and whose voice? Kitty's voice, Rio's voice, Augustine's voice, Josh, everyone out there, if we all put our voices, we can shout together, then people are gonna hear us and things are gonna get better. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we're the ukulele's, we say one more time. Listen to the message in our rhyme. Together we can make the whole world care. Together we can make the whole world care. Let's all love life together.
Break a tie in the House. The Speaker also oversees the administration and finances of the House of Commons. It manages its staff, acts as liaison between the Senate and the Crown. The Speaker is in charge of welcoming visiting dignitaries and diplomats and representing the House of Commons abroad. So in this part, the Speaker is in charge of welcoming and visiting dignitaries and diplomats. This is where he categorically fucked up. This is where you can certainly place the blame upon him. He did not vet the SS Nazi collaborator and then caused one of the most embarrassing moments in Canadian history, and certainly helped the Russian war effort in their illegal invasion of Ukraine in the process. How much do they make? $287,400. Fucking hell, I should be the Speaker of the House. They make $194,000 as an MP and then $92,000 as the Speaker. God damn, I could do that. I could fucking stand there. I'll have a better order. I won't be like, order. It's gonna be a long day. Order. I'll go full British there. You know, order to the Speaker. Quite 185. Thank you for gifting a tier 1 sub to Dark Native. I really appreciate that. No other business can come before the House until the election has taken place and the new Speaker has taken the chair. All MPs, except for cabinet ministers and party leaders, are eligible to run for the House Speaker. If an MP is not interested in running, they must officially resign from the ballot in writing. MPs who do not withdraw their name to not be the Speaker are allowed a 5-minute speech to try and sway the chamber in their favor. The voting system is a single preferential ballot system where each member votes by ranking the preferred candidates in order. Members who don't want to rank all the candidates can just vote on only one candidate if they wish. I like that it is preferred, ballot systems, but they also